MASH remains one of the most beloved television series ever made, and for many viewers, Radar O'Reilly was the heart of the 4077th. With his innocent personality, sharp instincts, and ability to know what was happening before anyone else, Radar felt less like a television character and more like a member of the family. Yet behind the scenes, the reality was far more complicated. Over the years, stories circulated about tension between Gary Burghoff and several members of the cast, particularly Alda. Decades later, Alda has finally reflected on those years with a perspective shaped not by resentment, but by time, understanding, and experience. To understand what happened, it helps to begin long before MASH ever existed. Gary Burghoff was born on May 24, 1943, in Bristol, Connecticut, and grew up in Wisconsin. Creativity surrounded him from an early age. His mother worked in several artistic fields, and young Gary spent much of his childhood around rehearsals, performers, and live productions. Long before acting became his career, he developed a passion for music. He studied tap dancing and drumming, quickly revealing a remarkable natural talent. By the time he reached high school, Gary was already performing professionally with experienced musicians. While many teenagers were still discovering their interests, he was playing in clubs and building confidence as a performer. Yet there was another part of his life that remained deeply personal. Gary was born with Poland syndrome, a condition that affected the development of his left hand. Although it never prevented him from pursuing his goals, he remained extremely self-conscious about it. Throughout his career, he often went to great lengths to conceal his hand from cameras. Anyone who revisits MASH today may notice how frequently Radar carried clipboards, held objects, or positioned himself in ways that kept his left hand out of view. These choices were not accidental. They reflected an insecurity that stayed with Gary for much of his life. Before becoming Radar O'Reilly, Gary had already established himself as a talented stage performer. In 1967, he originated the role of Charlie Brown in the off-Broadway production of You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown. His performance earned praise and demonstrated his ability to bring warmth and vulnerability to a character. Not long afterward, another unusual opportunity appeared. While performing as a drummer in Las Vegas, Gary worked alongside a young singer named Linda Carter, years before she became famous as Wonder Woman. The friendship they developed lasted long enough that she later helped him secure a guest role on her television series. Then came the opportunity that changed everything. In 1970, director Robert Altman cast Gary in the film MASH. Surrounded by larger personalities and more experienced actors, Gary's portrayal of Radar stood out immediately. Radar was different from everyone else in the camp. He was innocent without being naive, kind without being weak, and often seemed to understand people better than they understood themselves. Audiences connected with him instantly. When CBS adapted MASH into a television series in 1972, nearly every role was recast. Gary Burghoff became the lone exception. He was the only actor from the original film to continue playing the same character. For 7 seasons, he turned Radar into one of television's most beloved figures. The success was enormous. Gary won an Emmy Award and received multiple nominations throughout the show's run. Producers, writers, and fellow actors often praised his performances, recognizing the unique qualities he brought to the series. But success does not always guarantee happiness. As the show grew, Alda's influence expanded significantly. What began as a starring role evolved into something much larger. Alda started writing episodes, directing stories, and helping shape the creative direction of the series. From one perspective, it was a natural progression. Alda possessed talent beyond acting and wanted to contribute more creatively. From another perspective, however, some cast members began feeling that the balance of influence within the show was changing. Gary was one of them. Having carried the character of Radar since the original film, he believed he had contributed something essential to the success of the series. Over time, he became frustrated that his own creative ambitions were not receiving the same opportunities. He even submitted scripts and story ideas involving Radar, hoping to expand the character's role within the show. Those ideas were never fully embraced. Meanwhile, Alda's influence continued growing. What began as disappointment gradually turned into resentment. People who worked on the series later described Gary as increasingly unhappy. Some believed he felt underappreciated. Others felt he became difficult to work with. Whatever the exact reasons, tensions slowly developed behind the scenes. Stories circulated about arguments, misunderstandings, and personality clashes. Some cast members admitted they struggled with him professionally. Others acknowledged that despite those difficulties, they still considered him an exceptional actor. The situation became more complicated because Gary was also facing serious challenges away from the set. During the later years of MASH, his marriage was struggling. The pressures of fame, long working hours, and personal stress were taking a toll on his family life. Friends and colleagues noticed the strain. When the time came to film Radar's farewell episodes, emotions became overwhelming. In one scene, Radar speaks about his future and the life he hopes to build after leaving the army. According to people involved in production, Gary became so emotional during filming that he struggled to continue. The tears were not simply those of a character saying goodbye. They reflected a man confronting the reality that an important chapter of his own life was ending. Despite the challenges, CBS desperately wanted him to stay. Executives offered him a contract worth millions of dollars. At the time, it would have made him one of television's highest-paid performers. He turned it down. The decision shocked many people. Walking away from one of the most successful shows in television history seemed almost impossible to understand. Yet for Gary, the choice was about something larger than money. He needed distance from the pressures that had consumed so much of his life. In 1979, Radar officially left the 4077th. The departure remains one of the most emotional moments in the series. Viewers watched as the young company clerk returned home to Iowa, leaving behind the friends who had become his family. For audiences, it was the end of a beloved character. For Gary Burghoff, it was the end of nearly a decade spent living inside someone else's identity. Leaving MASH did not immediately bring Gary Burghoff peace. Walking away from a role that had defined nearly a decade of his life was both liberating and difficult. For years, millions of viewers had known him only as Radar O'Reilly. Now he faced the challenge of rediscovering who he was beyond the character. Many actors spend their careers searching for a role as iconic as Radar. Gary had already achieved it. The problem was that success sometimes becomes a prison. The public loved Radar so much that separating the actor from the character became nearly impossible. After leaving the series, Gary focused on rebuilding the parts of his life that had been neglected during years of production schedules and constant pressure. He spent more time with family, returned to hobbies he loved, and stepped away from the spotlight that had consumed so much of his energy. Although MASH continued successfully for several more seasons, many viewers felt something was missing after Radar's departure. The show evolved, but the innocence and warmth Gary brought to the series could never truly be replaced. Television executives still believed in his popularity. Several projects were developed around the Radar character, including a potential spin-off. One of those efforts became Walter, a pilot that imagined Radar's life after leaving the army. Despite interest from fans, the project never developed into a full series. Gary continued acting occasionally, appearing on popular programs such as The Love Boat, Fantasy Island, and Murder, She Wrote. Yet it became increasingly clear that he was no longer interested in chasing Hollywood success with the same intensity. Instead, he began focusing on interests that had nothing to do with celebrity. One of the most surprising chapters of his life involved wildlife and conservation. Long before environmental causes became mainstream topics, Gary had developed a deep love for animals. He worked with wildlife rehabilitation programs and spent countless hours helping injured animals recover. Friends often said that the compassion audiences saw in Radar was not an act. It reflected who Gary really was. His concern for animals extended beyond casual interest. He actively participated in rehabilitation efforts involving birds, squirrels, raccoons, and other wildlife. While many former television stars pursued publicity, Gary found fulfillment in quieter work that rarely attracted attention. Another passion emerged through painting. Gary became an accomplished wildlife artist. creating detailed paintings inspired by nature. One of his earliest works was inspired by a childhood memory involving a fox. The experience had stayed with him for decades, eventually finding expression through art. Painting offered something television never could. There were no ratings, no contracts, and no studio politics. There was only creativity. At the same time, his curiosity continued leading him in unexpected directions. He developed inventions, earned patents, and pursued interests ranging from fishing equipment to stamp collecting. People who knew him personally often described him as someone whose talents extended far beyond acting. The further he moved away from Hollywood, the more complete his life seemed to become. Meanwhile, MASH remained one of television's most celebrated achievements. New generations continued discovering the series, ensuring that Gary's performance as Radar would never be forgotten. Yet questions about the behind-the-scenes tensions never fully disappeared. For decades, stories circulated about disagreements, arguments, and strained relationships among cast members. Some accounts were exaggerated, while others contained elements of truth. Like many long-running productions, MASH brought together strong personalities working under intense pressure. Alda often found himself at the center of those discussions because his influence on the show became so significant. As writer, director, actor, and creative leader, he carried responsibilities that extended far beyond performing. Not everyone agreed with every decision. Not everyone felt equally valued. Those realities created tensions that sometimes lasted years. But time has a way of changing perspective. As Alda grew older, his reflections on those years became less focused on conflicts and more focused on memories. Rather than revisiting old disagreements, he increasingly spoke about the people who helped create something meaningful. After publicly revealing his Parkinson's disease diagnosis in 2018, Alda became an advocate for awareness, communication, and living openly with illness. His priorities shifted toward understanding, gratitude, and connection. It was during these later years that he surprised many longtime fans. On Gary Burghoff's birthday, Alda shared a warm public message recalling a funny moment from their years together on MASH. Instead of discussing disagreements or old tensions, he chose to remember laughter. The memory involved a scene where Gary became so amused that filming nearly fell apart. Alda recalled it affectionately, describing it as one of the funniest moments he had ever experienced on set. The message was simple, but it carried meaning. After decades of speculation about feuds and conflicts, Alda's focus was not on what had gone wrong. It was on a moment that had brought them both joy. Perhaps that is what happens when enough time passes. The arguments lose importance. The frustrations fade. What remains are the shared experiences, the friendships, and the memories that survived everything else. Today, Gary Burghoff lives a life very different from the one he lived during the height of MASH. He spends time with his art, his interests, and the quieter pursuits that matter to him. He is no longer defined by Hollywood expectations or television schedules. And Alda, now in his later years, seems to view their shared history through a lens of appreciation rather than conflict. The truth is that both men contributed something important to television history. Alda helped guide MASH into becoming one of the most respected dramas and comedies ever produced. Gary Burghoff gave audiences Radar O'Reilly, a character whose kindness, innocence, and humanity continue touching viewers decades later. Their relationship was not perfect. Few working relationships are. There were disagreements, frustrations, and difficult moments. But there was also mutual respect, shared success, and a bond created through years of working together. In the end, that may be the most honest version of the story. Not a tale of enemies. Not a tale of lifelong friends. Simply two talented men who helped create something extraordinary, carried their own struggles, and eventually found a way to look back with understanding instead of bitterness.